When the snow falls deep and the cold winds howl across the mountains, one man's extraordinary creation turned a simple tool into a legend. In the frozen wilderness, where survival depended on resourcefulness, his snow knife became the key to mastering nature's harshest elements. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If this story stirs your sense of adventure and innovation, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode will take you even deeper into the wild. Samuel Quinn had long known the mountain's unforgiving grasp. He had lived among their jagged peaks for years, a trapper by trade and a survivor by choice. The high country was a place where men could thrive or perish based on their wit, endurance, and ability to adapt. For Samuel, it was the art of survival that kept him alive, not just hunting and trapping, but the ingenuity required to weather the brutal winters. In the harsh winters of the Rocky Mountains, ice was both an enemy and a necessity. The rivers froze solid, and every breath he took in the thin air felt like ice cutting into his lungs. But ice was crucial. It was the key to keeping food fresh, melting water for drinking, and building shelters that could stand against the relentless chill. Yet cutting through the thick ice to gather water or preserve meat was no simple task. The tools the mountain men had were rudimentary at best, axes and hatchets, blunt and inefficient when it came to slicing through solid ice. It was something that had always bugged Samuel. Cutting through ice like butter seemed impossible with the crude tools they had. There had to be a better way, something more efficient, something that could turn the laborious task into something swift and effortless. One day, while studying the ice, his gaze fell on his knife, the tool he had carried through every trapline, every bitter cold night. He had always marveled at its versatility, a workhorse of a blade that had served him in countless ways, skinning game, cutting wood, and even carving basic tools. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this knife could be something more. It wasn't the perfect tool for cutting through ice, but perhaps with a few changes, it could be. He envisioned a blade that could glide through the thickest ice as easily as it cut through fresh meat. It was an insane idea, perhaps, but insanity was often the seed of innovation. And in the mountains, where the difference between life and death was often decided by the smallest of details, Samuel had always trusted his instincts. It was time to design something new. He spent days sketching out his ideas on the back of an old trapper's map, eyes narrowing in concentration as he tried to imagine every aspect of the design. The blade had to be long, sharp, and capable of holding an edge through the punishing work ahead. But it had to be more than just a knife. It had to be a tool that could cut into the ice with the precision and ease of a hot knife through butter. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more daring than the last. By the time spring arrived, Samuel had made up his mind. He would test his idea, not just in theory, but in practice. He gathered the materials he needed, a chunk of steel he had traded for months earlier, a piece of hardwood from the nearby pine grove, and a set of tools that had become as familiar to him as his own hands. The work would take time, but Samuel was no stranger to hard labor. He started with the blade. It had to be longer and thinner than the knives he had used before, but with a curvature that would allow him to leverage the blade's edge against the ice with maximum efficiency. The steel would need to be tempered just right, a delicate balance between sharpness and durability. If the steel was too brittle, the blade could snap under the strain. Too soft, and it would dull in a matter of days. Samuel worked through the early mornings and late nights, the rhythmic sound of his hammer striking metal a constant companion in the quiet wilderness. He molded the blade carefully, shaping it to his vision. As the steel took form, he began to build the handle, a sturdy grip that would hold firm even through the most grueling tasks. Samuel's hands were raw with the work, the constant friction of the metal and wood leaving deep, aching calluses. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. With the blade and handle completed, the final piece of his design took shape, the teeth. Not large, jagged serrations like those on a typical saw, but smaller, more refined grooves meant to grip the ice and allow the blade to slice through it with precision. It was an experiment. Would it hold up against the thick, brutal ice of the mountains? Or would it break under pressure, just as many of his past attempts had? The moment of truth arrived when the final product was ready. He could feel the weight of the knife in his hands, perfectly balanced, sharp, and deadly. He was ready. His breath visible in the cold mountain air, Samuel walked down to the ice that stretched out like a frozen river before him. His mind was racing, but his hands were steady as he drove the blade into the surface. The first cut was slow, but firm. The blade bit into the ice, and with a single, smooth motion, it slipped through like a hot knife through butter. Samuel couldn't believe it. The ice parted effortlessly, the grooves of the blade cutting with a precision he had never imagined. It was working. The knife was cutting the ice with the ease of slicing through a loaf of bread. Each movement felt more confident than the last. His design had worked. As he stood there staring down at the gleaming blade embedded in the thick ice, Samuel felt a strange sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just the blade he had crafted. It was a tool that would change the way he lived in the mountains, and soon it would change the way others survived too. When Samuel Quinn's snow knife sliced through ice like it was butter, the entire wilderness felt it. The mountains were vast and unforgiving, but the news of a blade that could conquer their chill spread quickly among the isolated trappers and pioneers scattered across the Rocky Mountain range. It wasn't long before Samuel found himself surrounded by curious visitors, each eager to see the miracle tool that had turned a mountain of ice into mere butter. At first, Samuel kept the details of his creation to himself, cautious of anyone who might try to steal his design or mock his obsession with perfection. After all, most trappers lived by simple tools, and Samuel's obsession with the knife seemed a little outside the norm. But as the weeks passed and the blade proved itself again and again, he realized there was little point in keeping it to himself. Survival was about community, after all, and this tool could save lives, his included. One afternoon, while Samuel was working on another batch of pelts near the river, he was approached by Isaac McLeod, a seasoned trapper who had been in the mountains nearly as long as Samuel himself. Isaac, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, watched Samuel cut through a block of ice with ease. His eyes widened in surprise, but there was a hint of skepticism in his voice when he spoke. "Now that's a fine bit of work," Isaac said, running a hand over his beard. "But I gotta ask, why go through all the trouble to build something like that when a good old hatchet'll do the job just fine?" Samuel wiped his brow, the chill of the mountain air stinging his face, but he smiled at the question. Isaac's attitude was typical of many mountain men. They weren't ones to tinker unnecessarily. They lived by the tools that had always worked, that had always kept them alive. But Samuel's thinking was different. It wasn't about tradition or simple function. It was about precision and efficiency, making the difficult just a little easier. "It's about time, Isaac," Samuel explained, looking down at the blade embedded in the ice. "It's about the hours spent swinging an axe for just one cut, this blade. It can save you days, and when the snow falls heavy and the rivers freeze solid, you'll wish you had a tool that can make the job a little easier." Isaac rubbed his chin, nodding slowly. He wasn't one to admit it, but Samuel's words made sense. The mountains demanded everything from a man: his strength, his will, his mind, and any tool that made the battle just a little bit easier was worth considering. Over the next few weeks, word of Samuel's creation spread like wildfire. One by one, trappers began making the trek to Samuel's cabin to see the tool in action. Some of them came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but by the end of winter, most had left with a new snow knife in hand, or at the very least, a deeper understanding of how it could change their lives. Some laughed and teased Samuel, calling him the mad inventor of the mountains. But there were others who saw the potential for this new tool to transform not just how they cut ice, but how they approached survival in the wilderness. Samuel's snow knife was no longer just a novelty. It was becoming a symbol of innovation, a quiet testament to the power of one man's relentless need to improve his chances in the unforgiving wilderness. The snow knife was an innovation that had the potential to transform the way men survived in the Rockies. But Samuel Quinn knew that the true test of his creation hadn't yet come. Stories of his snow knife had spread far and wide, but there was always doubt, a feeling that it could still be nothing more than a fluke, an isolated victory against the frozen wilderness. Samuel needed to prove once and for all that his knife could handle what the mountains threw at it. It wasn't long before that opportunity arrived. The fall of 1838 came early and fierce. The temperature dropped rapidly, plunging the region into a deep freeze that would set the stage for one of the harshest winters in recent memory. The rivers were thicker with ice than anyone could remember. Even the oldest trappers spoke in awe of the cold, and a sense of unease spread through the community. In mid-November, Samuel received word that Isaac McLeod had run into trouble. Isaac's cabin had been attacked by a pack of wolves while he was out hunting. He barely escaped with his life, but when he made it back to his cabin, he found the roof partially torn apart and the ice around the riverbanks nearly impossible to navigate. He needed to gather supplies before the full brunt of the winter set in. The problem? His old tools, his axe and hatchet, had been left behind in the scramble to escape the wolves. Isaac had nothing but his bare hands and the equipment he could find. Without hesitation, Samuel packed his supplies, took his snow knife, and set out in the biting cold to help Isaac. It wasn't just a matter of helping a friend, it was a chance for Samuel to test the true limits of his design. He knew the journey would be treacherous, and he wasn't sure what he would find, but he couldn't afford to wait. The trek was grueling. By the time Samuel arrived at Isaac's cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow-covered mountains. Isaac was inside, attempting to secure his roof with what little he had left. The ice was thick and stubborn, and every step Samuel took on the riverbanks felt like walking on a razor's edge. But when he unsheathed his snow knife and tested it against the ice, he knew this was the moment of truth. He cut through the ice with the ease of slicing bread. Each stroke felt effortless. The steel of the blade bit into the frozen surface and parted the ice with surgical precision. Samuel's breath clouded in the cold, but his hands remained steady. As he cut, he realized that this wasn't just about surviving the wilderness anymore. It was about conquering it. His creation wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol of the resilience he had cultivated in these mountains. As Isaac watched, he couldn't hide his astonishment. The snow knife had not only withstood the conditions, it had outperformed everything they had ever relied on. It was as though Samuel had unlocked some forgotten knowledge of the mountains, a secret held in the design of a single blade. The test had been passed, and it was clear. Samuel's snow knife was no fluke. As the two men worked together, cutting through the ice and securing the cabin, Samuel couldn't help but feel a profound sense of accomplishment. The blade, which had once been nothing more than a hope, had now proven itself in the harshest of trials. And as the first heavy snowfall of the season began to fall, Samuel knew that the snow knife would forever change the way the men of the mountains survived the winter. As the cold months dragged on, the snow knife continued to prove its worth in the unforgiving wilderness. What had once been an innovation designed solely for cutting ice now became indispensable for the men of the Rocky Mountains. It wasn't just the utility of the blade that made it so valuable, but the fact that it was durable, built to endure the harsh conditions of the wild, from freezing temperatures to the constant wear and tear of the unforgiving environment. For Samuel Quinn, the winter of 1838 was a time of reflection. He had created something that had changed the way men thought about survival in the mountains, and the tool had already saved lives. He'd helped Isaac McLeod secure his cabin and stockpile supplies. He'd seen his design spread to neighboring trappers, each one acknowledging its value in their daily routines. Yet despite the widespread acclaim, Samuel remained humble. He had never set out to become a legend. He had simply wanted to survive, and to help others do the same. One afternoon, as Samuel trekked through the forest to check his trap lines, he encountered a group of trappers from a neighboring settlement. They had been traveling for days, their bodies weary from the cold, their faces covered in frost. They stopped when they saw Samuel, eyes fixed on the snow knife strapped to his waist. "That's the one, ain't it?" said one of the men, a thin fellow named Amos. Samuel nodded, acknowledging the recognition. "It is. What brings you all this way?" "We heard tell of your snow knife," Amos replied. "Word's been spread, and we wanted to see it for ourselves. Some of us are getting tired of breaking our backs with these old hatchets. We thought maybe there's a better way." Samuel took a moment to study the group. These men, much like himself, had been living in the mountains for years. They had survived through their grit and their ability to make do with whatever tools they had. But the fact that they were now seeking out his creation told him something significant. This knife wasn't just a temporary curiosity. It was changing how the men of the mountains worked and thought about their survival. Without a word, Samuel unsheathed the blade and demonstrated its edge. With practiced precision, he slid it through a thick slab of ice that had formed along the riverbank. The blade moved effortlessly through the frozen surface, leaving a clean and sharp cut. The men stood in stunned silence, watching the blade work. It was unlike anything they had seen before, sharp, precise, and efficient. After a long pause, one of the trappers, a burly man named Jacob, spoke. "We've been using axes and hatchets for years, but this makes everything look so easy." Samuel smiled. "It's not magic, just a bit of careful thinking." The group was quiet for a moment before they exchanged glances, clearly impressed. They had known hard labor in the mountains, and this tool, Samuel's snow knife, could make their lives easier, saving time and energy. It was a small thing, but in the wilderness, small things made all the difference. As they talked, Samuel couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The test of time wasn't just about how well the snow knife cut, it was about how it had stood up to the rigors of daily life in the mountains. No other tool had proven itself as reliable in the face of nature's harshest challenges. Samuel's creation had become a part of the very fabric of mountain life, shaping the way men lived and survived. That winter, as Samuel and the other trappers continued to use the snow knife, something extraordinary happened. It was no longer just Samuel's creation. It had become the mark of a new way of thinking about survival. The snow knife, born out of necessity, had now become a symbol of adaptation, innovation, and, most importantly, the will to persevere. By early spring of 1839, the snow knife had cemented its place among the tools of the mountain men. It had started as a singular invention in the hands of one man. But now, Samuel Quinn's creation was spreading across the entire trapping community. Every day, more and more trappers could be found carrying their own version of the snow knife, some built to Samuel's exact specifications, others adapted to suit individual needs, but all inspired by the original design. The knife was no longer just a tool for cutting ice. Its unique, finely honed edge and sturdy construction made it a versatile weapon for any wilderness task. It could slice through thick wood just as easily as it could cleave through ice. The blade became as much a part of daily life as a rifle or a hatchet. It was used to clear trails, skin animals, and even as a last-ditch weapon when defending against a wild animal or an attacker. Despite its growing popularity, Samuel never sought recognition for his work. He was a humble man, more concerned with his own survival and the survival of those around him than with gaining fame. The story of the snow knife had spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Samuel found himself in the company of travelers who had heard of his invention and sought him out for advice. One of those visitors was a young man named Henry, who had recently ventured west from the settlements in the east. Henry was eager to make a name for himself in the mountains, but he lacked the skills and knowledge that many of the veteran trappers possessed. Samuel met him one cold morning when Henry arrived at his cabin asking to learn how to build a shelter and survive the brutal winters. After a brief conversation, Samuel agreed to take him under his wing. For the next few weeks, they worked side by side, Samuel teaching Henry how to trap, how to read the land, and how to survive when the snow piled deep and the wind howled through the trees. Henry, eager to learn, absorbed every bit of advice Samuel offered. One afternoon, as they were preparing for a long trek to check the trap lines, Henry asked about the snow knife. "Everyone's talking about it," he said. "How did you come up with the idea?" Samuel smiled, tightening the straps on his pack. "It wasn't so much about coming up with an idea. It was more about needing a better way. When you live out here long enough, you realize that survival isn't about just making do. It's about making things work better, more efficiently." Henry nodded thoughtfully, his eyes catching the gleam of the knife hanging from Samuel's side. "It's something that'll last." "That's the goal," Samuel replied. "Tools are meant to last, especially in a place like this." As the two of them made their way deeper into the wilderness, Samuel's thoughts turned inward. The snow knife had come to represent more than just his own ingenuity. It was a testament to the lessons learned through hardship and perseverance. Samuel had never set out to create a legend, but in the wilderness, legends were born from necessity. The snow knife was now a part of the mountain man legacy, a tool that had changed the way men survived the harshest elements, and a legacy that would endure long after Samuel Quinn was gone. As they approached the trapline, Samuel looked at Henry and saw in him the same hunger for survival and ingenuity that he had once felt. He knew that the legacy of the snow knife would live on, passed down through generations of trappers, hunters, and pioneers. And for Samuel, that was enough. His work had been simple but powerful, a tool forged from necessity, sharpened by time, and destined to leave a mark on the wilderness long after the snow had melted. As spring began to thaw the frozen earth, the mountains slowly came alive again. The harsh, relentless winter gave way to the tender shoots of green poking through the snow-covered ground, but the dangers of the wilderness were far from over. Samuel Quinn had witnessed the delicate balance of life and death in these mountains, and with each passing season, he came to appreciate the raw beauty of survival in the wild. It was during this time of transition, as the snow began to melt and the rivers swelled with runoff, that Samuel received a message from an old friend, Jacob Marshall. Jacob was a trapper from the northern reaches of the Rockies, a man known for his quiet strength and hardened demeanor. He had heard of Samuel's snow knife, and now he was in desperate need of help. The message was brief. "Grizzlies on the prowl. Cabin under siege. Need your knife. Now." Without hesitation, Samuel packed his gear and made his way north, his snow knife secured at his side. He knew the danger of grizzly bears. These massive beasts were a force of nature, capable of ripping through walls and overwhelming even the most prepared man. But Samuel also knew the power of his blade. He had designed it not just for ice, but for survival, against the elements, the wilderness, and in some cases, the animals that roamed it. The journey north took several days, and as Samuel traveled, he couldn't shake the sense of urgency that gnawed at him. He knew that grizzly bears were territorial, and when they were hungry or threatened, they could be relentless. The thought of a trapper's cabin being under siege by such a beast was enough to quicken his step. When Samuel finally arrived at Jacob's cabin, the sight before him was chilling. The cabin's door had been torn off its hinges, the frame splintered, and deep claw marks gouged the logs. The snow knife would be put to its ultimate test here, against a force of nature, the grizzly bear, a creature whose sheer strength could destroy anything in its path. Jacob stood at the cabin's edge, a rifle in his hands, but his expression was one of exhaustion and fear. "It's not just one bear," he said, his voice gruff. "It's two." They've been circling the cabin for days. I can't keep them out much longer." Samuel didn't need any more explanation. He saw the signs, the tracks, the claw marks, the destroyed door. These bears were intelligent, calculating, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The time for words was over. The two men moved quickly, preparing the cabin for the worst. They reinforced the remaining walls, set up makeshift barriers, and stationed themselves at strategic points inside. Samuel handed Jacob the snow knife, now more than just a tool. It was the weapon of last resort. If the bears tried to breach the cabin again, Samuel was ready to use the knife in ways it had never been intended. The first attack came just as night fell. The heavy thud of bear paws echoed in the snow, and the low growl of the grizzlies vibrated through the air. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands remained steady. The bears had returned, and they were angrier than ever. With one swift motion, Samuel drew the snow knife. The blade gleamed in the moonlight as he positioned himself by the door, ready to face the beasts that were charging toward him. The first bear slammed against the cabin wall, its massive claws tearing at the logs. Samuel waited, watching, his grip tight on the knife's handle. When the bear finally made its move, it was quick, too quick for a rifle shot. But Samuel had his knife. With precise, calculated movements, he drove the blade into the space between the logs, wedging it into the weakened sections of the wall where the bear had tried to claw its way in. The sharp edge of the knife sliced through the wood, creating an opening just large enough for the men to defend themselves. Jacob took aim with his rifle, the shot ringing out as the second bear charged in. The noise, the chaos, and the raw power of the attack left no room for doubt. The snow knife had passed its test. It had held its ground against the grizzlies, creating a vital opening that allowed the men to survive. After the bears retreated into the night, Samuel and Jacob looked at each other, breathless but alive. The snow knife had once again proven its worth, not just as a tool, but as a symbol of survival, ingenuity, and the will to face nature head-on. With the bears driven off and the cabin secured, Samuel Quinn and Jacob Marshall sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the cabin. They were both exhausted, their clothes torn, their faces smeared with dirt and blood. The night had been harrowing, but they had survived. The snow knife had proven its worth once more, not just as an instrument of ice and wood, but as a tool of last defense in the wild. Jacob's expression was one of quiet reverence as he looked at the blade lying on the table. "I've seen a lot in these mountains, Samuel, but that knife of yours, it's something else. It saved our skins tonight." Samuel nodded, though he felt a quiet humility settle over him. "It's just a tool, Jacob, nothing more." Jacob shook his head, his hand resting on the hilt of the snow knife. "No, it's more than that. It's the difference between life and death. It's ingenuity when we needed it most. And it's a damn good reminder that even out here, in the harshest of places, there's always a way." Samuel glanced out the cabin window, the snow now falling gently, covering the tracks of the bears that had threatened their lives. The wilderness had tested him in ways he never could have predicted. It had stripped him of everything, from his loved ones to his home, and yet it had given him something in return, an understanding of the land, of survival, and of the power of invention. He had never set out to become a legend. He had never expected his snow knife to become a symbol of resilience for the men who roamed these mountains. But in the stillness of the cabin, with Jacob beside him, Samuel realized something he had never fully understood. Sometimes, survival wasn't just about outlasting the elements. It was about leaving behind something that would outlast you. The snow knife, once an experiment, had become a legacy. And as Samuel looked out into the snow-covered wilderness, he knew that no matter what happened next, his creation would continue to carve its mark in the mountains long after he was gone. He wasn't just a man of the mountains anymore. He was a man whose ingenuity had shaped the very land he had fought to survive on. The legacy of the snow knife would live on, a testament to the ingenuity and will of one mountain man who refused to give up. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the storm raged outside, Samuel Quinn allowed himself a moment of peace. For in that moment, he knew that his work had changed the mountains, and the men who called it home, forever. Years passed, and the Rocky Mountains continued to claim lives and test those who dared to call it home. But Samuel Quinn's snow knife had left its mark on the land and its people. Trappers, hunters, and settlers across the region spoke of the mad mountain man who had crafted a tool capable of cutting ice like butter and defending against the fiercest beasts. His creation had become a standard for survival, passed down through generations, revered as much for its ingenuity as for the spirit of its maker. Samuel never sought recognition for his work, nor did he ever profit from his invention. His life remained simple, focused on the land, the seasons, and the quiet rhythm of survival. But in the cabins of the Rockies, in the hands of the men who fought to live, the legacy of his snow knife endured. It was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of resilience in a harsh world, a reminder that in the face of nature's most ferocious trials, there was always room for innovation. In the end, Samuel Quinn's true victory wasn't the snow knife. It was the silent testament to human ingenuity that continued to echo through the mountains long after he had faded into history. By the time Samuel reached his final years, the rugged wilderness of the Rockies had become both a home and a graveyard of memories. His hair had grayed, his hands more worn from years of toil, but his mind remained sharp. He had lived a life filled with hardship, perseverance, and innovation, one that had changed the way men survived in the wild. When Samuel passed quietly and without fanfare, there were no grand eulogies or monuments. Yet, the men who had known him remembered the quiet mountain man whose creation had saved lives and whose legacy endured in every snow knife that cut through the ice. As his body was laid to rest in the peaceful Oregon hills, Samuel's story didn't end in the silence of the grave. His snow knife lived on, passed from one generation to the next, its steel still cutting through the harshest conditions of the American wilderness. And in the distant echoes of the mountains, where the snow still fell thick and the grizzlies roamed, Samuel Quinn's legacy remained a part of the land he had shaped, forever, remembered by those who survived because of him.